Do you think that there's any chance Victoria will be able to get out of this by the 19th of August?
Well, I hope so, Annalise. I'm not really expertise enough to know whether they will or they won't, but you can only hope. I mean, the Prime Minister said again today he sort of made a pretty veiled criticism about the contact tracing in Victoria. He noted that New South Wales, by contrast, had only recorded 17 new cases, and he pointed out their quote, end quote, very effective contact tracing regime. So, Victoria's very much behind the eight ball and all else because it just didn't have those systems in place at the start. Now, we sort of know as of Friday last week, they sort of got to where they should have been in the beginning in terms of getting onto people within 24 hours who may have been in contact with somebody. So let's just hope in another week's time we start to see those numbers come down, but I don't think we're going to know for a little while yet.
It is interesting to see the public showing is that they want to make sure it looks like the federal government's in step with Victoria. They don't want to demonise the state because people there are really suffering right now. But you can see that there is that internal frustration with the response in Victoria.
Oh, very much so, and it's been there for quite a few weeks. I think it's sort of bubbling to the surface more often than not in the last few days, and we saw Peter Dutton sort of take a bit of a swing last week in terms of saying it would have helped if Daniel Andrews would have accepted the federal intervention earlier. So, but look, outwardly outwardly the government there's no point having a fight with Victoria. It's a problem. It's a serious problem. People are dying. People are getting sick. People are losing their businesses again. So there's no point having a blue over it. That can come later. We'll come out in the wash about who didn't do their job, but it really is, on the surface at least, a matter of trying to fix this, and with the feds doing everything they can to help the states. But it also, I think, politically, Annalise, there's a little bit of distancing going on there between the federal government and the state government, because this is certainly not an error the federal government's making.
No, distancing is the key word these days, isn't it? But when we look at the response from the federal government today, they've announced the COVID Commission is going to refocus its energy onto the recovery, in particular the economy. This seems like a pretty deliberate move from the federal government to try and pivot its message away from the health response, leave that to the states.
Well, I mean, we've still got to do that, don't we? I mean, the rest of the country is trying to get back to normal. If it weren't for what happened in Victoria, we would have been a lot more normal by now. We would have been flying to Melbourne for the footy and going to Queensland for holidays and possibly even have that New Zealand bubble open. That was the plan back in May, and it all came unstuck because of the outbreak in Victoria. But, overwhelmingly, you've got to fight what's going on in Victoria, but you've also got to get on with trying to open the rest of the economy up. And what the Prime Minister announced today was an extension and an expansion of that committee led by Nev Power. So it's sort of gone from one of just sort of responding to the crisis and helping keep supply lines open and ensuring we had the sufficient manufacture of critical products to now pretty much advising the Cabinet on policy, on economic policy ahead of the budget. And in that context, they've expanded the membership quite significantly. A couple have dropped off, a couple of new ones have come in, but there's been a whole bunch of new areas of expertise added. So that's, I guess that's to be welcome. The more voices pouring into the policy making process, I guess the better.
And Nev Power is an interesting choice, the former chief executive of Fortescue Metals. Mining has been consistently singled out by the government as being the industry that's keeping us going at the moment, but also very susceptible to China's whims.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. I mean, there's been all sorts of accusations from some quarters about conflicts of interest and so forth. It was interesting that Kath Tanner of Energy Australia jumped off the committee for the next phase, which I assume confirms there will be a big energy component there somewhere. But look, I don't know whether Nev Power's advising the government on China policy. I would strongly suspect not, because the government is going fairly gangbusters at the moment with the US on China. So whether it's Kerry Stokes or anyone else in Western Australia urging restraint. From a business perspective, it's certainly not getting much of a hearing in Canberra. It's quite rapid and significant, the change that's occurred in the last 72 hours or so about us going lockstep with the US on the South China Sea and now ramping it up in America this week at the AUSMIN talks.
Yeah, all eyes are on that trip. It's a big deal when they send the Foreign Minister and the Defence Minister knowing they'll have to quarantine for 2 weeks when they come back. But just finally,
indeed.
also interesting comments in the last week from the Treasurer referencing Margaret Thatcher in particular that seemed to raise a lot of eyebrows. Really not that surprising, though, when you've got a Liberal Conservative government in power, that they'd take their inspiration from former Conservative leaders.
Yeah, sort of. Look, I said this on another show yesterday. I don't think it was a good idea invoking Thatcher. Yes, she was a sort of champion of supply-side economics in the 80s, but in the eyes of the union movement, she is the antichrist, and so they just hate her because she took on the unions big time in the UK in the 80s and basically destroyed the movement to a large extent down there. So this is at a time when the government here is trying to work with the union movement in the spirit of cooperation to get the reforms necessary. It's and these talks that are going on at the moment, Annalise, it's more about actually trying to get back to the Hawke-Keating way of doing things with industrial relations, not the Margaret Thatcher way of doing things. So, look, it's good red meat for the coalition base, but I don't know whether it's in their interest at the moment to be throwing red meat to the base. And I do note that the Prime Minister at his press conference an hour or so ago didn't share Josh's enthusiasm for the Thatcher-Reagan comparisons and said this is the Australian solution. So might be the last we hear of that, I would suggest.
Who knows, maybe we're going to get some free milk out of it. But it is interesting. This was raised by Josh Frydenberg a few times. And so do you think that this is a deliberate approach? And will this inform, do you think, how we go forward with the economic response?
Look, not really. I mean, he raised it on Friday. It was in response actually to a headline in our newspaper in the Financial Review, and he was commenting on that. And I think it was probably more throwaway than serious on Friday, but he certainly doubled down on it yesterday morning on the Insiders program on the ABC and, sort of owned it quite boldly. No, I don't think it is. I mean, Thatcher and Reagan, they operated in different times. I mean, the 80s were different times. I mean, not everything they did was great. And, basically their reforms left us with massive debts and deficits. I mean, not everything they did were entirely different to the path Hawke and Keating pursued too. I mean, they pursued a supply-side agenda as well, albeit it was more tempered. So, but this is different now. We're in this recession due to the forced closure of business by governments. In response to a disease. It's not some sort of structural economic downturn that's been forced on us by, sort of broader, more slow-working factors. So. It's a different thing. It's a different crisis. It requires a different response. But the government's view is, that this is their view as the coalition. The way out of this is to grow the economy by driving business demand. So inevitably there'll be some similarities in terms of lower taxes and things like that they would do. But I think I'll probably share the Prime Minister's point of view. It requires a sort of unique Australian first response. But if you want to keep the Labor movement on side, just sort of a bit quiet on the Thatcher stuff might help.
I think that would be wise advice. I guess, no, they don't. Just to touch on what you were saying before about the relations with China, Canberra has become increasingly hawkish with China, and it does seem like this is growing in prominence, especially with the closure of those consulates in Chengdu and Houston. Do you think that we could be facing down a new Cold War, something reminiscent of what Thatcher and Reagan had to face?
Look, it's starting to feel that way. I mean, again... it's different. I mean, Russia didn't have during the Cold War, the Soviet Union certainly didn't have the economic clout that China has. So it was less able. The main threat coming from the Soviets was military back in that period. For China, it was both military and economic. So you want to be a bit careful before you really, provoke China too far. I think the thing people are worried about a bit, Annalise, at the moment is: are we doing this for the right reasons, or is it, because you've got to be very wary of what Donald Trump's up to at the moment. He's becoming increasingly unhinged, and he's got an election to win, and he's going to start doing some fairly extreme things, I would imagine, between now and November. So you would hope we're not getting caught up in that what we're doing is based on something more sound and sustainable. And it was only late last year when we were in the US with the Prime Minister, and he was giving these speeches about not taking sides and no need to take sides. But it now appears quite outwardly that we are taking sides, and this began with that quite strong speech he gave a couple of weeks back to the adverts of the Defence Academy. So, look, let's hope they know what they're doing, and let's hope it's not. We're just getting caught up in some sort of Trump wave. Of course, the consequences for us could be, quite harsh.
Yeah, huge. I guess the one comfort we have is that just about everyone's got some diplomatic issue with China at the moment. So certainly interesting times to live through. Phil Coorey, as always, thank you for your time.